What if your country never signed up for a war? But suddenly, your banks, shipping companies, and exporters are being asked to pick a side. That is essentially the message coming out of Washington after the US launched what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has dramatically called Operation Economic Outcast. And yes, the name is as subtle as the policy. Bessent compared it to D-Day in World War II, saying the US wants to cut Iran off from every economic lifeline until Tehran is effectively isolated. So what exactly is America doing? And more importantly, why should India care? Let's break this down. But first things first, what is Operation Economic Outcast? On August 24, the US Treasury announced a massive new sanction campaign against Iran, targeting nearly 60 entities, individuals, and vessels across multiple countries. But this isn't Washington simply sanctioning Iran and being done with it. Washington is going after the entire ecosystem that keeps Iranian trade alive. Oil traders, shipping networks, financial intermediaries, technology suppliers, and even third country companies helping Iran move money and goods.
Today, at President Trump's direction, the United States Treasury has begun Operation Economic Outcast, an unprecedented campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran and its enablers. In the Second World War, D-Day marked the historic beginning of a campaign with our allies to target and drive the enemy from its positions, including those in third countries. Today, in that same spirit, we are launching an economic onslaught against Iran's financial connections around the globe. Our objective is to sever every economic lifeline that sustains this tyrannical regime until Tehran stands alone.
The US has also expanded sanctions exposure across 5 sectors: digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. Basically, Washington is saying, if Iran finds a back door, we are going after the person holding the door open. And that's where things get interesting, because US sanctions don't stop at America's borders. But how can the US pressure other countries? This is where the phrase secondary sanctions becomes important.
The final refuge of this regime is the mistaken conclusion of nations that still finance the Iranian threat in the hopes of evading it. It is no longer acceptable to operate in the gray spaces of this conflict. Countries cannot claim they are blind to enabling this activity. Iran's enablers purchase, transport its petroleum. They facilitate the flow of its finances through exchange houses and free trade zones. They welcome Iran's flights and maintain registries on its behalf. They turn a blind eye to seaborne fuel transfers and overland transits. They condone illicit use of their banks, all the while concealing the extent of their complicity.
Imagine an Indian company does business with Iran. The company may not be American. The transaction may not even happen in America. But if Washington decides that the company is helping Iran evade sanctions, it can potentially be cut off from the US financial system. And for a company operating internationally, that's not exactly a minor inconvenience. The US dollar still sits at the center of global finance, which gives Washington enormous leverage. The US Department of Treasury has now told countries that it expects them to shut down identified Iran-related activities within specified timelines. And if they don't, Washington says it can act unilaterally. In other words, you don't have to agree with our sanctions, but you may still have to live with them.
Teams from Treasury, State, and the U.S. military are now meeting with their global counterparts to tell them that the United States expects action. Every country has a defined timeline to shut down activities we have identified. If they do not take action, we will do so unilaterally through Treasury authorities. For example, every branch of Bank Melay must be shuttered and dark. And let me be clear, any entity that facilitates money laundering on behalf of Iran will be removed from the US dollar system. The clock just started ticking.
And India has already been hit. This is where the story stops being just about Iran. The US has sanctioned 4 India-based companies and 3 Indian nationals over alleged involvement in Iranian petroleum and petrochemical trade. The companies are Portis Partners LLP, Sadashiva Overseas Limited, PP Softtech Private Limited, and Prakriti's Infra Impex India Private Limited. Washington alleges that these firms were involved in importing or facilitating Iranian petroleum and petrochemical products. The numbers are significant. The US says Sadashiva Overseas imported around $69 million worth of Iranian origin petroleum products between February 2024 and June 2025. BP Softtech is accused of importing around $25 million between January 2024 and June 2025. And Prakriti's Infra Impex, another roughly $25 million between May 2023 and February 2026. That's about $119 million in transactions, cited across those 3 major companies alone. Portis Partners, meanwhile, was accused of facilitating multiple shipments of Iranian petrochemicals into India, while Indian nationals linked to the companies were also sanctioned.
The new sectoral sanctions determinations issued today target 5 of Iran's most vital lifelines that it exploits in other countries: digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. These measures broaden secondary sanctions risk for anyone foolish enough to continue conducting business with this regime, and will accelerate the speed with which we pursue them. As I speak, Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control is also sanctioning over 60 entities, individuals, and vessels around the world that enable the Iranian regime to procure illicit nuclear and missile technology, conduct cyber operations, and generate oil revenue.
So Washington isn't merely telling Tehran, we don't like your oil trade. It's telling global middlemen, if you help sell it, you can become part of the sanctions net too. But here's the irony for India. India's direct dependence on Iranian crude is actually far lower than it used to be. Back in financial year 2018 to 2019, India-Iran trade was nearly $17 billion. Indian imports were $13.5 billion, of which $12.4 billion was Iranian crude oil. Then US sanction waivers ended in 2019. India stopped regular Iranian crude purchases and bilateral trade collapsed by more than 90%. By financial year 2025 to 2026, India's exports to Iran were only around $1.2 billion, while imports were below $375 million mark. So you might ask, if India isn't heavily dependent on Iranian oil anymore, what's the big deal? Well, oil isn't the only thing India sells to Iran. Iran is a major market for Indian basmati rice. In just the first 6 months of 2026, India exports shipped around $383 million worth of rice to Iranian buyers. And if sanctions make payments, shipping, and insurance harder, Indian exporters could get stuck with a very familiar problem. The rice is ready, the buyer wants it, but the money can't move. And when exports get stuck during harvest seasons, excess supply can come back into India's domestic market. That can mean lower prices for farmers, particularly across major basmati producing regions such as Punjab, Haryana, and Western Uttar Pradesh. So a sanctions policy designed in Washington can eventually show up in farmers' balance sheet in India. That is why this is important. Then there's tea and pharma. Indian tea exports to Iran were worth around $14.34 million in the first half of 2026. And pharmaceuticals and food products are generally covered by humanitarian exemptions. But here's the catch. Banks don't always want to take the risk. This is called overcompliance. Basically, a bank is thinking, technically this transaction may be allowed, but why take the chance? So legitimate trade can still face payment delays, higher insurance costs, and additional scrutiny. Because apparently in international finance, even being technically innocent doesn't guarantee that someone won't panic and press the block transaction button. And then there's the Chabahar Port. India signed a 10-year contract in May 2024 to develop and operate the Shahid Behashti terminal at Chabahar. Now what does India gain from this? Chabahar gives India a strategic route into Afghanistan and Central Asia, without going through Pakistan. It is also important for India's wider international North-South Transport Corridor, or INSTC. That corridor is planned as a roughly 7,200-kilometer multimodal route connecting Mumbai to St. Petersburg through Iran and the Caspian region. But if banks won't finance Iranian port operations, if shipping companies don't want to call at Iranian ports, and if equipment suppliers fear American secondary sanctions, then Chabahar Port becomes strategically important on paper, but painfully difficult in practice. And that is exactly India's dilemma. Then there is the oil price problem. India may not be buying much Iranian crude, but India still buys a lot of crude globally. And if Washington successfully squeezes Iranian exports, especially if Chinese purchases are disrupted, global oil markets could tighten. China has rejected Operation Economic Outcast, vowing to protect its national interest. China remains the biggest buyer of Iranian crude, with estimates putting those imports at around 1.2 to 1.5 million barrels per day. If those barrels disappear from the market, somebody has to replace them. And that could mean higher global oil prices. Every $10 per barrel increase in crude could add roughly $14 billion to India's current account deficit, while also putting pressure on the rupee and domestic inflation. So India's problem isn't necessarily where will we get Iranian oil. It's what happens to the price of everybody else's oil. So what does India do? New Delhi now has to perform a rather uncomfortable balancing act. It needs to protect its companies from US secondary sanctions, while keeping its strategic relationship with Iran alive. It needs Chabahar. India wants access to Central Asia. It wants cheaper and diversified energy. At the same time, Indian banks and businesses remain deeply connected to the Western financial system. So India will likely push for clarity and exemptions, especially around strategic projects like Chabahar, while exporters may look for alternative payments and trade mechanisms. Because the bigger lesson from Operation Economic Outcast is simple. You don't have to be Iran to get hurt by Iran sanctions. If you trade with Iran, ship for Tehran, finance Tehran, or even help move the paperwork, Washington wants to drag you into war. And India is very well known for its multi-alliance stance. So for India, the question isn't whether to choose between America and Iran overnight. It's whether New Delhi can keep doing business with both, without becoming collateral damage in America's economic war on Tehran. This is Shivangi Mukherjee for India Abroad.